Thank you for watching the video. Through the story, I invite you to a place of peace and gentle sleep. Please relax and take your time to drift off into a restful slumber.
The village's silent plea. The village was nestled deep within a valley, shrouded in the soft glow of a full moon. Tall trees surrounded it on all sides, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, creating a natural wall of shadow. The night was peaceful, yet an undeniable tension lingered in the air, like the calm before a storm. The only sounds that disturbed the stillness were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Inside the elder's house, the atmosphere was far from calm. The room was dimly lit by a small flickering lantern, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The elder sat at the head of the room, his back straight and rigid, gripping a worn wooden staff with hands that had seen many seasons. His face, lined with the wrinkles of age, bore an expression of deep contemplation. Around him, several younger men from the village gathered, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the danger that loomed over their heads. "The bandits, they'll strike again, won't they?" one of the younger men said, breaking the uneasy silence. His voice quivered slightly, betraying the courage he was trying to muster. The elder nodded solemnly. "Yes, they've been watching us. They always do this before they attack." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. He kept his eyes on the window, where the moonlight filtered in through the cracks in the wooden frame. One of the men, braver than the rest, stood up suddenly, his fists clenched. "We can't sit here and wait for them to destroy us. We have to fight back." The elder's gaze remained steady, though his expression darkened. "And how many more lives are you willing to lose?" His words were measured, deliberate, and they struck the young man like a blow. The village had already lost too many to these bandits. They were no match for their ruthless tactics and superior numbers. A heavy silence fell over the group, each of them contemplating the hopelessness of their situation. They lacked the weapons, the training, and most of all, the strength to fend off the bandits. But the elder wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to just above a whisper. "There may be another way." The younger men looked at him, confusion crossing their faces. One of them spoke, hesitant but curious. "What do you mean?" The elder shifted in his seat, his voice growing even quieter, as if he were afraid the very wind might overhear. "There is an old story," he began, "a legend passed down from the days of our ancestors. Long ago, when our people first settled in this valley, they too were besieged by invaders. But one night, when the moon was full, a warrior appeared, silent as a shadow. No one knew where he came from or who he was. But he fought off the invaders with unmatched skill and vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had arrived." The men listened intently, captivated by the elder's words, though skepticism lingered in their eyes. The bravest of them spoke again, this time with less certainty. "And you think that warrior will come again?" The elder's gaze drifted back to the window, where the moon shone brightly against the night sky. His voice was barely audible now. "I don't know," he admitted, "but tonight the moon is full again." The men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to believe in the elder's story or dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man. But deep down, a flicker of hope sparked in their hearts. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was truth in the legend. The shadow warrior appears. The bandits approached the village under the cover of night, their movements stealthy but purposeful. They had raided many villages before, and this one was no different to them. Their leader, a tall, muscular man with a scar running down the side of his face, marched ahead, his eyes scanning the darkened homes like a predator stalking its prey. Suddenly, the wind shifted. The leaves in the trees rustled more than before, as if something, or someone, was moving among them. The bandit leader stopped, raising a hand to signal his men to halt. His eyes narrowed as he turned his head, searching the shadows. "Who's there?" he barked into the night, though no response came. He waited, listening intently, but all he heard was the soft sigh of the wind. The other bandits shifted uneasily behind him, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. "It's just the wind," one of them muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The leader hesitated for a moment longer before lowering his hand and motioning for them to continue. "Let's go." But as they took their first step, a sudden movement caught his eye. A shadow, barely distinguishable from the night itself, darted through the trees. The bandit leader's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively drew his sword. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice rising in panic. This time, there was a response. It was not a voice, but the sharp hiss of a blade slicing through the air. Before any of the bandits could react, one of their own fell to the ground with a thud, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. Chaos erupted. The bandits drew their swords, shouting in confusion and fear, but it was too late. The shadowy figure moved among them like a phantom, striking with deadly precision. One by one, the bandits fell, their cries muffled by the night as the warrior's blade flashed in the moonlight. The leader watched in horror as his men were cut down with terrifying speed. He tried to fight back, swinging his sword wildly, but it was no use. The shadow warrior was too fast, too skilled. In a matter of minutes, the bandit leader found himself alone, his men lying motionless at his feet. Panting heavily, the leader turned to run, but the shadow warrior appeared before him, blocking his path. The leader froze, his eyes wide with terror. What are you?" he stammered. The warrior said nothing. His face was hidden behind a mask, his eyes cold and unyielding. He raised his sword, the blade gleaming in the pale light of the moon. "Please, don't," the leader begged, his voice trembling. He dropped his sword, falling to his knees in desperation. "Spare me." For a moment, the warrior stood still, his sword poised to strike. But then, slowly, he lowered the blade. The leader's heart raced as he looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You will leave this village," the warrior said in a voice so calm it sent chills down the leader's spine. "And you will never return." The leader nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet. He turned and fled into the darkness, not daring to look back. The shadow warrior watched him disappear into the night, his expression unreadable behind his mask. With the bandits gone, the warrior sheathed his sword and melted back into the shadows, leaving no trace of his presence behind. The silent dawn. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon, the village began to stir from its quiet slumber. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, and the long shadows cast by the surrounding trees slowly receded into the earth. The crisp morning air was still, carrying with it the faint scent of dew on grass and the distant chirping of birds greeting the new day. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, something unspoken lingered, like the final note of a psalm resonating long after it had been played. The villagers, unaware of the battle that had unfolded while they slept, emerged from their homes, stretching their stiff limbs and yawning with the ease of those who believed the night had been uneventful. They went about their usual routines, gathering water from the communal well, feeding their livestock, and preparing breakfast over small fires. There was no sign of the chaos that had raged just hours before, no trace of the bandits who had planned to strike fear into their hearts. Life, as far as they could tell, was normal. Yet, something felt different. It was as though the village itself had been touched by a quiet hand of protection, a guardian's invisible presence. The birds sang more sweetly, the wind whispered more gently through the trees, and the rising sun bathed the land in a warm, golden light. For a moment, the village felt like a place untouched by the troubles of the world, peaceful, almost sacred. The elder of the village stood at the edge of his small wooden house, watching the villagers go about their morning tasks with quiet contemplation. His heart, however, was not at ease. He had heard nothing of the events that had transpired in the night, but his instincts, honed by years of experience, told him that something had happened, something that would not reveal itself easily. His eyes drifted to the clearing just beyond the village, where the forest began, its dark canopy thick and unyielding. The elder had spent many years wandering those woods as a younger man, and he knew every twist and turn of the hidden paths that wound through the trees. Yet, he had never encountered what the villagers called the phantom, the shadowy figure who had long been the stuff of legend. It was said that, in times of great peril, the village was protected by a silent warrior, one who moved through the night like mist, leaving no trace behind. The elder had heard these stories since childhood, passed down from generation to generation, but in his many years, he had never witnessed the presence of such a warrior until now. He didn't need to see the battle to know that it had occurred. The faint tremor in the air, the way the birds had fallen silent for just a moment before dawn, and the inexplicable calm that had settled over the village told him all he needed to know. He sighed softly, a mixture of relief and sorrow filling his chest. Relief, for the village had been spared, sorrow, for the knowledge that such violence had been necessary. One of the villagers, a young boy no older than 12, ran toward the elder, his face bright with youthful energy. "Elder," the boy called out breathlessly, his voice cutting through the stillness of the morning. "There are strange footprints near the forest's edge." The elder turned to the boy, his brow furrowing slightly. "Footprints?" he repeated, his voice calm but curious. "Yes," the boy nodded eagerly. "I was collecting firewood when I saw them. They're bigger than any of ours, and they're strange. You should come and see." The elder's heart quickened, though his expression remained composed. He nodded slowly. "Show me," he said, his voice steady. The boy led the elder down the narrow dirt path that wound through the village, past homes where smoke from cooking fires spiraled lazily into the sky. As they approached the edge of the forest, the elder noticed that the usually thick undergrowth had been disturbed. Bushes were crushed, and the dirt was uneven, as though someone, or several people, had moved through the area quickly, without care for the usual quiet of the woods. The boy pointed to the ground near the forest line. "There," he said, excitement in his voice. "Do you see them?" The elder knelt slowly, his old bones protesting the movement, but he ignored the discomfort. His sharp eyes focused on the ground before him. Sure enough, there were footprints, large and heavy, clearly made by someone who wore armor or thick boots. They were unlike the light, nimble footprints of the villagers. These were the marks of men accustomed to war. Bandits, the elder thought grimly. He traced the direction of the footprints with his eyes, following them as they led toward the trees. His gaze lifted to the forest, where the shadows clung to the branches like dark memories, and his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the first row of trees, were more footprints, many more. The ground was disturbed in multiple places, as though a great struggle had taken place, but the bodies of the fallen were nowhere to be seen. The elder rose slowly, his joints creaking in protest. He glanced back at the village, where the other villagers were still going about their morning routines, blissfully unaware of what had nearly befallen them. He turned back to the boy, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Go back to the village," the elder said quietly. "Tell no one of what you've seen here." The boy hesitated, confusion flickering in his eyes. "But..." "Go," the elder repeated, his voice gentle but firm. "This is not for the others to know." The boy, sensing the gravity of the elder's words, nodded and turned to leave, though he cast one last curious glance over his shoulder before running back to the safety of the village. The elder remained at the forest's edge, his thoughts heavy. He had no doubt that the village had been saved by the legendary shadow warrior, the Phantom. The footprints of the bandits told the story that the village would never know. But where was the warrior now? And why had he chosen to protect them? As the elder gazed into the depths of the forest, he thought he caught a glimpse of something, a movement, a flicker of shadow against the trees. But when he blinked, it was gone, as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole. The elder bowed his head in silent gratitude, his heart swelling with the knowledge that the village was safe, at least for now. The Phantom had come, just as the legend said he would, and the bandits had been driven away. But the elder knew, deep down, that peace was always temporary. The bandits would return, or others like them, and the village would once again face the threat of destruction. He could only hope that when the time came, the Shadow Warrior would return once more to protect them from the darkness that always seemed to linger at the edges of their lives. With a final glance at the forest, the elder turned and began the long walk back to the village, his heart heavy but hopeful.